The question, when was that point of no return, after which the Western Roman Empire was doomed, has been worrying people for a long time. Therefore now we together will try to define where Rome has turned wrong. The death of Aetius, probably the most popular point of no return among the public. The last Roman, the great savior from the Hun threat, Aetius dies because of the treachery of the emperor he faithfully served. But the death of Aetius essentially changed little. By the time of his death, the once great empire was left with a fragment in Italy, a little bit of Gaul, a small piece of Spain. Formerly the federates were still Visigoths and Franks, but in fact they ruled already independent kingdoms. The empire had no money not only to maintain the loyalty of these federates, but also for a normal army, and therefore fought mostly these federates. The reason for this situation was the loss of control over Africa, which occurred while Aetius was still in power. The capture of Carthage by the Vandals caused a crisis in the entire Western Roman economic system. Could this be the point of no return? The Vandals' seizure of Africa. There is no doubt that this is one of the key events that undermined Rome's strength. The province of Africa had been Rome's breadbasket for centuries, providing up to 30% of the Western Empire's income through taxes, but more importantly, it provided a stream of cheap grain for Italy, which had long been unable to feed its own population. After the last attempt to wrest Africa back from the West and East together failed, the Vandals made a sophisticated peace with Rome whereby they became federates, retained control over Africa, and even paid part of the taxes. Only an eighth of the former taxes now irregularly received Rome, but these losses were the last straw. Rome was already deprived of almost all income from Gaul and Spain. Italy has long been a black hole, only absorbing untold funds from the treasury, and so Rome was forced to make a good face at a bad game. Worst of all was that with sharply reduced income had to buy grain from the Vandals, so that in Italy did not start a famine. In such conditions and so chronically underfunded, since the collapse of the borders in 405, the army is even more reduced. Rome enters a vicious circle where decreasing revenues cause the army to shrink, which leads to the loss of even more territory, and the loss of more and more territory causes a decrease in revenues. Yes, the conquest of Africa was the event that prefigured the total collapse of Rome, which lost its once great army in the middle of the 5th century. But the Vandals appeared in Africa for a reason, and as part of a completely schizophrenic, in its essence, internal policy, when the military leaders under a weak ruler used barbarians to fight for power, with the behind-the-scenes influence of Constantinople. After all, it was because of the conflict with Aetius that Boniface, the Comite of Africa, called the Vandals to his aid, promising them money for the favor. Without this internal turmoil, would Africa have held out? If you think about it, there was a chance. Constantius III, by the grace of God, Emperor of Rome, but he died at a very bad time. What's the point of no return? Death of Constantius III. Constantius III was probably the last emperor who could actually rule successfully. A successful military commander under the mediocre Emperor Honorius, who managed to recapture most of the territories lost to Rome in just 10 years after the fall of the previous savior of Rome, Stilichon. For such great successes, Emperor Honorius does the unthinkable, gives him the title of co-emperor and imperial insignia. This causes a storm of indignation in Constantinople, as they are afraid that the fragile string of dynastic dependence on the East will finally break, and both states will inevitably become rivals. But Honorius had a strong argument, not accepted, however, in the East. The wife of Constantius is Galla Placidia, the daughter of Theodosius the Great, and so his son will have no less rights to the throne than any appointee from the East. For childless Honorius to find a good successor was extremely important, and this, not the most fortunate and intelligent of rulers, still made the right choice. Constantius was not only a talented military commander, but no less a good politician and administrator. It was under him began his ascent, Aetius. But insidious fate struck a blow. Constantius died suddenly just a few months after receiving the porphyry, and in 2 years went into the next world, and Honorius leaving the empire in the hands of the young son of Constantius and his mother. Galla Placidia will all the time try to hold on to power, being between several factions at once, led by powerful temporizers. But there is a nuance here. Valentinian III, who was the son of Constantius, was incapable of governing. And so, even if he stabilized the situation in the empire, Constantius would have handed over power to a weak and weak-willed man, which would undoubtedly have led the empire back to turmoil, albeit on a slightly firmer footing. And so the root cause of the problem lay deeper. Rome had been heading towards such a situation since the death of Theodosius. Struggle for authority among environment of emperors of the West, which, including has shown itself and in non-recognition by the East Constantius, has been caused by the subordinate position of Rome concerning Constantinople. If Constantius had lived long enough to succeed Honorius, and undoubtedly the Eastern Roman Empire would have supported any challenger against him, as happened with Aetius, for example. And Eastern interference in Western affairs even began from the very death of Theodosius, when Stilicho fell victim to an intrigue against him in which Constantinople played a huge part. The Western Roman Empire was not a fully independent state. Constantinople coordinated each new ruler of Rome and made sure that the authorities of the West did not start to be too independent and strong. This state of affairs was necessary for the East to keep the two parts of the empire together, deliberately keeping the Western Roman Empire in a weakened state. And so it is the final division of the empire, according to the will of Theodosius, can be the very point of no return. The division of the empire into Eastern and Western under Theodosius. The fact that it was the division of the empire into Western and Eastern Empire became the point of no return. This is generally a very popular opinion, and it is difficult to argue with it, since the very configuration of the division was specific. At first glance, everything looks like that the problematic western part of the empire was separated from the rich and prosperous East so as not to spoil life, but in reality, it's a bit more complicated than that. I will only briefly outline the reasons why the partition was inevitable, and why in such a way. First, because of the huge size of the empire, reaction time to the threat was catastrophically low, while the order to redeploy troops will come from Rome. While the emperor himself will reach the front and take command, the situation can change dramatically. As long as there were few enemies, the local commanders coped with threats without the need to involve the center. But once the number of threats increased, it was impossible to repel threats without the intervention of the emperor and his ability to redeploy troops. Therefore, the decision-making center is moved closer to the most threatened area. For Rome in the 4th century, this is, oddly enough, Persia. But having gained a strategic advantage in reaction time in the East, the empire also lost it in the West. Realizing this problem led to the division of the empire between co-rulers already under Constantine's successors. At the same time, the partition had another argument. If earlier the emperor could denude one of the borders for the sake of gaining an advantage on the other, sacrificing in the moment security, but because of the weakness of enemies not risking much, now each of the emperors was interested in not weakening beyond measure the borders in their area of responsibility, which, in theory, should have led to a less adventurous policy. That said, the division of the empire was done on the basis of who had more threats, and, again oddly enough, the Eastern Roman Empire held 3 important borders at once: the Danube, the Caucasus, and the Mesopotamian, the last 2 of which were the borders with the Persians. Whereas the RRI held only the Germanic frontier, which was threatened by seemingly much weaker enemies than the Persian superpower. This is why the East got disproportionately richer regions at partition, as it had to spend much more on security. And, as it should be clear by now, Theodosius was not the inventor of this position. The division of the empire after his death differed little from the already established practice in the 4th century, and rather this unity of the empire under Theodosius was a deviation from the norm, which became possible after the Battle of Adrianople. And it is after this battle that the Goths of Alaric come on the scene, who will besiege Rome 3 times, also a point of no return, Adrianople, again a very popular version of the point of no return. The large Roman army is almost entirely exterminated by barbarians within the empire, and even so the emperor dies. This is unprecedented for the 4th century, but it's not exactly news for the history of Rome, which consists of 99% exertion. Thinking back to the invasion of the Simurs and Teutons, who sawed off several consular armies, we realize that it's not all that bad. Indeed, the death of the emperor did not lead to the collapse of the empire. The Eastern Roman Empire was still strong, although forced to take an operational pause in hostilities. More important here is another thing. Even though the Eastern Empire lost the battle, it will create problems for the Western Empire, as the new Emperor Theodosius will conclude a federation treaty very favorable for Alaric. Thanks to it, Goths not only will keep the power, but also will be able, after death Theodosius, to use chance and to invade Italy. That will lead to withdrawal of forces from the Germanic border, and soon it will collapse under the pressure of barbarians. And all this because of the loss at Adrianople. And in fact, the battle itself and the form in which it took place was impossible without dividing the empire in two, as the emperor of the East Valentus rushed into battle, fearing that the joint victory over the invading Goths can give more benefits to the emperor of the West Gratian. That is, we again return to the fact that the root of evil is the division of the empire and rivalry between the rulers of both halves of the empire. And so it is necessary to rewind time back to the reasons that prompted to begin to divide the empire in half. The crisis of the 3rd century. Yes, we had to rewind time back 100 years, but it was here that a whole set of reasons developed that would eventually lead to a crisis on the borders of the empire in the 5th century. Again, I have already discussed the causes of the crisis in more detail. Importantly, the cause of the empire's crisis lay in the fact that by the middle of the 2nd century, there was a crisis in the economy. Due to the rising costs of the army and the fall in tax collection caused by the colder climate and the increased tax burden, the empire's expenditures and revenues ceased to match. At the same time, there is a collapse of Parthia, which, because of problems with the economy, Rome did not take advantage of and allowed the emergence of a strong and aggressive Persia, which immediately began to bite the empire. This leads to even greater destabilization of the economy, degradation of old political institutions, and, in the end, the outbreak of civil war. Usually, it is the beginning of civil wars that is associated with the crisis of the 3rd century. But it is important to realize that the crisis itself began at the very beginning of the 3rd century, under Commodus. It is from this time the empire increasingly begins to deal only with internal affairs, leaving foreign policy to itself. This leads to the fact that for almost 100 years, the barbarians can develop without constant divide and conquer on the part of the Romans, which allows them from amorphous tribal structures to emerge more or less integral barbarian kingdoms. In the 4th century, when the empire will throw off the shackles of internal problems, these kingdoms will be much more dangerous rivals, which will require much more resources to contain. And there was trouble with resources. During the Civil War, the old system of provincial government, which had been inherited from the Republic, finally died and collapsed into the abyss along with the economy of the empire. The new system in the person of the imperial bureaucracy only just formalized under the late Antoninus and Severus, and therefore its spread to all levels of government will be slow and will end only under Constantine in the first third of the 4th century. The empire at the end of this process will have a much better system of administration than before, but in the process of the crisis, the economy of the western part of the empire, devastated by the incessant wars in its territory, will fall into significant decline. Rome, after the crisis, is an empire with a strong state apparatus but a weak economy in much of its territory. It is in the general course of the crisis of the 3rd century that the weakness of the western part of the empire lies. The crisis led to a weakening of the economic power of the empire, to the strengthening of the barbarians, and the situation when it will have to divide the empire into two parts for the sake of better management of defense and build up the army. At the same time again, it is during the crisis, after the reforms of the army of Alexander the North, the regionalization of armies takes place. Soldiers begin to receive land plots during their service in order to be more motivated to defend the frontier. But this also leads in the end to the fact that such defenders have very little desire to go far from their land, and therefore a large part of the army turns into garrisons, where the soldier is more a landowner than a fighter. These internal causes will make it impossible to somehow avoid the decline in the quality of the army by the 5th century, nor the division of the empire into West and East, nor the economic weakness of the West. The external reasons were the strengthening of Persia and the greatly increased conflict on its border, which required an even larger army. The economy was not well off from this, but there was another external cause, strangely enough, common to one of the causes of the 3rd century crisis: climate cooling. It was it that destabilized the economy of the empire in the 3rd century, and it was it that, according to the prevailing opinion among historians, caused the beginning of the movement of masses of nomads from the Great Steppe to the west. It is in the complex of external and internal causes led to the fact that the Western Roman Empire was unable to repel the barbarian onslaught. It is not difficult to see that none of the factors was decisive, so that to explain everything at once. Nevertheless, I believe that it was in the 3rd century that the point of no return was passed, as processes were launched in the empire that would eventually culminate in the abolition of the Empire of the West. If we go all the way to the end of the road, the crisis of the 3rd century did not arise in a vacuum by itself, and its causes had been brewing for centuries. And the key moment here will be creation of empire by Octavian Augustus, as exactly at him the system of authority where the key source of it will be army will be fully formed. It was Octavian's victory that determined for centuries the vector of Rome's development, and we can say that this is the zero reason for the fall of Rome in the 5th century, not the point of no return, but a clearly marked path to it.